The stained glass windows of the Durango First Methodist Church had never witnessed such a pitiful spectacle. When Adelaide Montgomery, the town's most coveted heiress, stood at the altar in a borrowed, fraying dress, the pews vibrated with muffled snickers and cruel whispers. Her groom didn't wear a tailored suit, but worn leather and rough wool that smelled of wood smoke and pine. They called him a savage, a penniless hermit who had dragged the belle of the county into the dirt. They laughed as she rode away on the back of his draft horse, clutching her meager belongings. But their laughter would curdle into suffocating silence exactly 1 year later, when the true identity of the quiet mountain man brought the entire state of Colorado to its knees. In the spring of 1888, Durango, Colorado, was a town built on the volatile promises of silver and railroad iron. At the very pinnacle of this fragile society sat Horace Montgomery and his daughter, Adelaide. Known affectionately and sometimes enviously as the Durango Rose, Adelaide was a vision of refined Eastern upbringing transplanted into the rugged West. She wore silks imported from Paris, played a grand piano shipped over treacherous mountain passes, and was engaged to Preston Sterling, the ambitious, sharp-jawed son of the town's primary bank owner. Adelaide's life was an uninterrupted waltz of garden parties and secure futures until the day the music violently stopped. It happened with the collapse of the Silver Queen mine. Horace Montgomery had secretly leveraged everything: his mansion, his investments, even the trust fund left by Adelaide's late mother, to back a massive excavation project deep in the San Juan Mountains. When the vein dried up and the miners struck unyielding granite, the debt was called in. It was a staggering sum, entirely insurmountable. The descent from royalty to ruin took less than 48 hours. Adelaide vividly remembered the Tuesday morning the bailiffs arrived. Sheriff Bill Langdon, a man who had eaten Sunday roast at their mahogany dining table just weeks prior, wouldn't even look her in the eye as he nailed the foreclosure notice to their grand oak front door. Horace, utterly broken by the shame and the financial devastation, suffered a severe stroke that very afternoon, leaving him bedridden and unable to speak. Adelaide turned to the only lifeline she thought she had, Preston Sterling. She ran through the dusty streets to the Sterling Bank, her skirts dragging in the mud, desperate for her fiancé's help to at least secure medical care for her father. Preston met her in the lobby. He didn't invite her into his private office. Standing beneath the brass chandeliers, surrounded by peering tellers and gossiping customers, Preston looked at her not with love, but with cold, calculating detachment. "I am deeply sorry for your father's misfortune, Adelaide," Preston said, his voice loud enough for the room to hear. "But you must understand, a man in my position cannot be tied to a family drowning in disgrace and debt. My father would never permit it. Our engagement is dissolved." He handed her a small envelope containing $50, a pitiful severance package for a broken heart, and turned his back. The town of Durango followed Preston's lead with ruthless efficiency. High society is never kinder than when you are wealthy, and never crueler than when you are poor. Women like Martha Higgins, who used to beg Adelaide for fashion advice, now crossed the street to avoid her. The Montgomery estate was auctioned off piece by piece. Adelaide and her incapacitated father were forced into a drafty, one-room boarding house on the edge of town, right above a noisy saloon. For 3 months, Adelaide worked herself to the bone. She took in laundry, scrubbing until her knuckles bled. She mended clothes by candlelight, her once immaculate hands becoming calloused and scarred. But the medical bills for her father's care were mounting, and the boarding house owner, a ruthless man named Jebediah Stone, was demanding double rent. Winter was fast approaching. In the high country of Colorado, winter was not merely a season, it was an executioner. If she couldn't find a way to pay for coal and medicine, her father would not survive until Christmas. Adelaide had reached the bitter, terrifying end of her rope. It was a biting Tuesday in late October when Adelaide pushed through the heavy wooden doors of Miller's General Store. The wind outside was howling, carrying the first icy threats of snow. She approached the counter, her hands trembling as she unclasped a heavy gold locket from her neck. It was her mother's, the only piece of value the bank hadn't seized, because Adelaide had kept it hidden in her corset during the raid. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I need medicine for my father. And coal. Please, tell me what you can give me for this." Elias Miller adjusted his spectacles, examining the locket with a critical eye. Before he could speak, a cruel, familiar voice echoed from the doorway. "Well, if it isn't the Durango rose, shedding her last petals." Adelaide froze. Preston Sterling strolled into the store, flanked by two of his wealthy friends. He wore a heavy tailored overcoat with a fur collar, looking every inch the prosperous banker. He walked up to the counter and snatched the locket from Miller's hand. "A pretty trinket," Preston sneered, holding it up to the light, "but barely worth the gold it's stamped on. I'll give you $10 for it, Addie. Consider it an act of charity." Tears of pure humiliation pricked Adelaide's eyes. $10 wouldn't even cover a week of her father's medication. "Give it back, Preston," she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Or what?" Preston laughed, tossing the locket in his hand. "Who is going to defend your honor now? Your crippled father? Hand the lady her property." The voice was low, rough as untumbled gravel, and resonated with a quiet, terrifying authority. The laughter in the store died instantly. From the shadows of the back aisle stepped a man. He was tall, imposing in a way that made the spacious store feel suddenly cramped. He wore faded canvas trousers, heavy leather boots, and a thick woolen coat that smelled of the deep forest. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, but his eyes, a piercing, stormy gray, were locked dead onto Preston Sterling. The town knew of him, though few knew his name. Gideon Cross. He was a mountain man who lived high up in the treacherous San Juan peaks, coming down to Durango only twice a year for supplies. Rumors painted him as a dangerous hermit, a man who spoke to bears and shot trespassers on sight. Preston sneered, though he took a small step back. "This is none of your concern, mountain man. Go back to your pelts." Gideon didn't argue. He simply closed the distance between them in two massive, silent strides. His large, calloused hand wrapped around Preston's wrist like an iron vise. He squeezed. Preston gasped, his face draining of color as the locket tumbled from his fingers. Gideon caught it with his free hand, then released the banker with a shove that sent Preston stumbling backward into a barrel of flour. "Get out," Gideon rumbled. Preston, flushed with rage and embarrassment, scrambled to his feet. "You'll regret that, you filthy savage," he spat, before retreating out the door with his friends in tow. Gideon turned to Adelaide. He gently placed the locket back into her palm. "Keep it," he said. Then, he reached into his heavy coat, pulled out a worn leather pouch, and dropped it onto the counter. It hit the wood with a heavy, metallic thud. He untied the strings, revealing a pile of raw, gleaming gold nuggets. "Give her whatever she needs," Gideon told Miller, who was staring at the gold with wide eyes, "and have a doctor sent to her boarding house, paid in full." Adelaide was stunned. "Sir, I cannot accept this. I have no way to repay you. I am completely ruined." Gideon looked down at her. For a moment, the storm in his gray eyes softened. "I know who you are, Adelaide Montgomery, and I know your situation. Walk outside with me." Bewildered and desperate, she followed him into the freezing alleyway. The wind whipped her thin shawl around her shoulders. Gideon stood blocking the wind, offering her a momentary reprieve from the cold. "I am a man of the high timber," Gideon said quietly. "I live a hard life and a lonely one, but I have land and I have provisions. I need someone to keep my homestead running while I am out working the high ridges for weeks at a time. A partner." He paused, looking away for a brief second before meeting her eyes again. "If you marry me, I will clear your father's debt. I will pay for him to be moved to the finest sanatorium in Denver, where he will receive the best care money can buy.
This story was
In
posted on the
exchange,
channel The
you will
Rusty
come up the
Saddle.
mountain
Please
with
do
me.
not repost
You
it
will
in
be
any
my
form.
wife." Adelaide stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. A marriage of convenience to a wild, untamed stranger. It was scandalous. It was social suicide. But high society had already killed her. This man, a terrifying mystery, was offering her father his life back. "Why me?" she asked, her breath misting in the cold air. "Because," Gideon said softly, "I watched how you handled yourself in there. You have a spine of steel, Adelaide. You'll need it where we're going." 3 days later, they stood in the First Methodist Church. The town turned out not to celebrate, but to spectate. They giggled into their gloved hands as Adelaide said her vows to a man who looked like he had just walked out of a wilderness nightmare. Preston stood in the back, a mocking smirk on his face. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Gideon didn't kiss her. He simply nodded, offered her his arm, and led her out of the church. He hoisted her onto the back of his massive draft horse, climbed up in front of her, and rode out of Durango toward the looming, snow-capped peaks. Behind them, the laughter of the town echoed down the valley. They didn't know it, but they were laughing at a ghost. The ride up into the San Juan Mountains was a terrifying, exhausting ordeal. For 2 days, they climbed steep, treacherous trails that clung to the edges of dizzying drop-offs. Adelaide clung to Gideon's waist, the heavy wool of his coat her only anchor against the howling wind and the terrifying heights. He rarely spoke, but when the horse stumbled, his hands were instantly there to steady her, his movements surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. When they finally broke through the tree line on the evening of the second day, Adelaide braced herself to see a miserable dirt-floored hovel, a leaky log cabin smelling of animal hides and grease. Instead, she gasped. Nestled in a protected valley overlooking a pristine, frozen alpine lake sat a beautiful, sprawling timber home. It wasn't a shack, it was a marvel of craftsmanship. The logs were perfectly notched, the windows were made of thick, clear glass, and a large stone chimney breathed a welcoming plume of smoke into the twilight sky. Gideon dismounted and lifted her down with effortless strength. He opened the heavy oak door and ushered her inside. The interior was even more shocking. It was immaculate. High-beamed ceilings hung over a spacious living area. Thick, woven rugs covered the polished floorboards. In the corner sat a cast-iron stove radiating glorious heat. But what stole Adelaide's breath was the back wall. It was lined entirely with custom-built bookshelves, groaning under the weight of hundreds of leather-bound volumes. Dickens, Thoreau, ancient Greek philosophy, and heavy tomes on geology and engineering. In the center of the room sat a massive, hand-carved mahogany desk, upon which rested a silver inkwell and a stack of complex-looking blueprints. Adelaide turned to her new husband, her eyes wide with confusion. You read?" Gideon removed his coat, revealing a simple, clean linen shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "The mountains are quiet, Adelaide. A man needs voices to keep him company during the long winters." Over the next few weeks, Adelaide's perception of her life and her husband began to violently shift. Gideon was nothing like the brute Preston and the town had claimed him to be. He was a man of strict routine and profound silence, but he was fiercely respectful. He gave her the master bedroom, choosing to sleep on a cot near the fire. He showed her how to manage the wood stove, how to preserve the meat he brought back from his hunts, and how to read the clouds for incoming blizzards. In the evenings, while the wind screamed outside the thick glass windows, they sat by the fire. He would read his heavy books, and she would read the novels he encouraged her to borrow from his shelves. Sometimes, she would catch him looking at her over the rim of his reading glasses, glasses he hid whenever they went into town with an expression of quiet intensity that made her stomach flutter. But the mystery of Gideon Cross only deepened. Once a week, regardless of the weather, A solitary rider would brave the dangerous trail to their cabin. It was a man named Elias Reed, a weathered, tight-lipped courier who rode a horse, bred for endurance, not local mountain work. He never stayed for coffee. He simply handed Gideon a thick, wax-sealed leather pouch and took a similar pouch in return. Adelaide accidentally caught a glimpse of one of the envelopes one afternoon while dusting the mahogany desk. It bore the heavy, embossed seal of the First National Bank of Denver, an institution far more powerful than the Sterling Bank in Durango. It was addressed not to Gideon Cross, but to Mr. G.C. Director. When she politely asked him about it over dinner, Gideon simply said, "Investments, Adelaide. A man must plan for the future." His tone brooked no further questioning. The isolation of the mountain was beginning to feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. Adelaide found herself laughing again, her cheeks flush with health from the crisp mountain air. She found herself watching the strong lines of Gideon's back as he chopped wood, feeling a strange, warming ache in her chest. He was her husband in name only, but he protected her with a ferocity she had never known. But the real world has a way of finding you, even at 10,000 feet. It was mid-November. A massive snowstorm had blanketed the valley, sealing them off from the world below. Adelaide was in the kitchen, kneading bread dough, humming a tune she hadn't thought of since her father's mansion was sold. Gideon was at his desk, frowning over a large topographical map. Suddenly, the heavy dogs that Gideon kept outside began to bark frantically. A vicious, snarling sound that meant someone was approaching. Gideon stood up instantly, his hand dropping smoothly to the heavy revolver holstered on his hip. He moved to the window, his eyes narrowing into slits. Adelaide wiped her hands on her apron, her heart leaping into her throat. "Is it Elias? It's too dangerous to ride in this weather." "It's not Elias," Gideon said, his voice cold and flat as a frozen lake. He unlatched the heavy door and stepped out onto the covered porch, the wind immediately whipping snow into the cabin. Struggling through the waist-deep drifts, leading an exhausted, half-dead horse, was a figure bundled in furs. As the man reached the edge of the porch, he collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. He pulled the fur scarf down from his face, and Adelaide gasped, dropping her wooden spoon. It was Preston Sterling. His face was blue with cold, his lips cracked and bleeding. He looked up, his eyes wild and desperate, ignoring Gideon completely as his gaze locked onto Adelaide. "Addie," Preston gasped, his voice raspy and broken. "You have to come with me. Now. I know what your father did. I know what he hid before the bank took everything. You're still rich, Addie. You're the richest woman in Colorado, and this savage is keeping you prisoner." Gideon did not draw his gun. He simply crossed his arms over his massive chest, looking down at the shivering, pathetic banker with an expression that wasn't anger, but a terrifying, calculating calm. "Mr. Sterling," Gideon said softly, the gravel in his voice cutting right through the howling wind. "You have trespassed on the wrong mountain." The wind screamed like a wounded animal as Gideon grabbed Preston Sterling by the collar of his expensive, snow-caked coat and dragged him over the threshold. The banker collapsed onto the woven rug, a shivering, pathetic heap of wet wool and chattering teeth. Gideon slammed the heavy oak door shut, throwing the iron bolt and instantly silencing the storm's fury. Adelaide stood frozen by the kitchen counter, her hands still dusted with flour. She watched as her husband, the man society called a brute, methodically stripped the frozen layers off the man who had publicly ruined her. Gideon didn't say a word. He fetched a heavy wool blanket, threw it over Preston's trembling shoulders, and poured a measure of dark amber whiskey into a tin cup, shoving it into Preston's stiff hands. "Drink," Gideon commanded, his voice rumbling in the warm cabin. Preston choked down the liquor, his eyes darting frantically around the immaculate, well-lit room. He took in the grand stone fireplace, the towering bookshelves, the mahogany desk. Confusion warred with the desperate greed in his pale blue eyes. This was not the squalid trapper's shack he had expected to find. I I don't understand, Preston stammered, his teeth clicking. He looked at Adelaide, his gaze dropping to the simple,
This
clean
story was
dress she
posted on
wore,
the channel The
noting the
Rusty
healthy
Saddle.
flush in her
Please do not
cheeks.
repost it in
Addie,
any form.
you're not bound? He hasn't locked you away? The only thing I am bound by, Preston, is my own choice, Adelaide said, her voice remarkably steady. The fear she thought she would feel at seeing him again was entirely absent. In its place was a cold, crystallizing clarity. Why are you here? You nearly killed yourself climbing the pass in a November whiteout. Preston struggled to his feet, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. The warmth of the fire seemed to thaw his arrogance as quickly as his limbs. I came to save you, Addie, to bring you home. The bank, my father. We made a mistake. Gideon stood by the fireplace, leaning his broad shoulder against the stone mantel. He crossed his arms, his stormy gray eyes fixed on Preston. Banks like yours don't make mistakes, Sterling. They make calculations. What changed your math? Preston sneered at Gideon, emboldened by the whiskey. This is business far above your comprehension, mountain man. It pertains to civilized society. He turned back to Adelaide, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Addie, your father didn't lose everything in the Silver Queen collapse. Before the stroke, before the bailiffs arrived, Horace transferred the deed to the Animas Valley Tract, 3,000 acres of prime riverfront land, directly into a blind trust in your name. My father's clerks only discovered the discrepancy in the county ledger 3 days ago. Adelaide's breath hitched. The Animas Valley Tract was a piece of wilderness her father had bought years ago on a whim. She had thought it worthless. You're a wealthy woman, Addie, Preston urged, taking a step toward her. You are the sole owner of that land, completely protected from the bank's foreclosure. You don't have to play house with this filthy savage anymore. Come back to Durango with me. We can reinstate our engagement. We can be the kings of the county. Silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the burning pine logs. Adelaide stared at Preston, feeling a profound wave of nausea wash over her. It wasn't love that had driven him up a treacherous mountain in a blizzard. It wasn't guilt. It was sheer, unadulterated greed. He had discarded her when she was a pauper, and now he was willing to brave death to claim her as a prize once more. Before Adelaide could speak, a low, humorless chuckle vibrated from the fireplace. Gideon pushed himself off the stone mantel. He walked slowly toward his mahogany desk, opened the top drawer, and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound folder. He tossed it onto the center table. It landed with a loud smack. You are a fool, Sterling, Gideon said softly. A predictable, transparent fool. Preston blinked. What is that? That, Gideon replied, is a certified topographical survey of the Animas Valley Tract commissioned 6 months ago. By me. Preston's jaw went slack. You can't read a survey. Not only can I read it, I drew it, Gideon said, stepping closer to Preston, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the banker. I know exactly why you want that land, Sterling. It's not for the timber. It's not for the river access. Gideon's eyes flicked to Adelaide, softening for just a fraction of a second before hardening into flint as he looked back at Preston. It's because the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad is expanding, Gideon stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. General William Jackson Palmer is pushing the narrow-gauge line directly through the San Juans to reach the silver booms in Silverton. And the only viable grade for those tracks runs straight through the center of Adelaide's Animas Valley Tract. Whoever owns that land holds the railroad by the throat. Your father wants to extort Palmer for millions. Adelaide gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The pieces violently slammed into place. The letters from Denver, the blueprints, the weekly courier. Preston's face twisted into an ugly, desperate snarl. His hand darted beneath his wet coat, and in a flash of polished steel, he drew a silver-plated double-barreled Derringer, aiming it directly at Gideon's chest. "You know too much, you backwoods freak," Preston spat, his hand shaking violently. "Addie is leaving with me, and you are going to sign over whatever claim you think you have as her husband, or I will drop you where you stand and tell the sheriff it was self-defense." Adelaide screamed, but before the sound could fully leave her throat, Gideon moved. He didn't flinch. He didn't shout. With a speed that defied his massive size, Gideon's hand lashed out. He didn't go for the gun. He struck Preston's wrist with the edge of his palm. A sickening crack echoed through the room. Preston shrieked, dropping the gun as his wrist shattered. In the next second, Gideon had Preston pinned face down against the floorboards, a heavy knee pressed between his shoulder blades. The banker sobbed, his bravado entirely broken. Gideon picked up the Derringer, snapped it open, and let the 2 bullets fall into his palm before tossing the useless weapon into the fire. He looked down at the weeping man. "I told you once before." "Sterling," Gideon growled, the wildness of the mountain finally bleeding into his voice. "You have trespassed on the wrong mountain. You will sleep in the root cellar tonight, and at first light, if the snow breaks, you will walk back down to your miserable bank. If I ever see you near my wife again, I won't just break your wrist." The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the valley buried under 4 feet of pristine, blindingly white snow. True to his word, Gideon hauled a terrified, whimpering Preston out of the root cellar, strapped a pair of snowshoes to his boots, and marched him 2 miles down the trail until the path to Durango was clear. When Gideon returned to the cabin, the sun was high, casting long, blue shadows across the snowdrifts. He found Adelaide sitting at the massive mahogany desk, her hands resting gently on the leather folder he had thrown down the night before. She didn't look up as he kicked the snow from his boots and hung his heavy coat by the door. "You killed a bear last year," Adelaide said quietly, her eyes tracing the intricate topographic lines on the exposed blueprint. "That's what the women in town whispered. They said you killed it with your bare hands." Gideon walked into the kitchen, pumping water into the tin basin to wash his hands. "It was a mountain lion, and I used a rifle. Gossip in Durango is more fiction than fact." "And what about you, Gideon?" she asked, finally turning in the heavy leather chair to face him. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Are you fiction or fact? Because the man who married me in a borrowed suit to pay off my father's debts is not a simple trapper." Gideon dried his hands on a towel. He walked over to the desk, his presence filling the space. For a long moment, he just looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the steel spine he had recognized that day in Miller's store. She wasn't afraid of him. She was demanding her due. "My full name is Gideon Cross," he began, his voice low and steady. "I was born in Boston. I graduated from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with degrees in civil engineering and geology. 5 years ago, I came west." Adelaide stared at him, stunned. "Meet? But why the act? Why the worn clothes and the isolation?" Gideon pulled up a wooden chair and sat across from her, his knees nearly brushing her skirts. "Because out here, an Eastern engineer in a tailored suit is a target. He's a mark for swindlers, claim jumpers, and corrupt bankers like the Sterlings. I realized quickly that if I wanted to map these mountains and buy the right claims, I needed to be invisible. People ignore a dirty mountain man. They don't look twice at a hermit. It allowed me to survey the entire San Juan Range without drawing the attention of the mining syndicates." He reached out, his large, rough fingers gently tracing the edge of the blueprint on the desk. "I am the chief surveyor for the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad, Adelaide. General Palmer pays me a small fortune in blind trusts to find the routes the trains need to take. I've bought up dozens of strategic parcels of land under dummy corporations." Adelaide's mind reeled. "And my father's land? The Animas Valley tract? I knew about it," Gideon admitted, his gaze meeting hers with unflinching honesty. "When the Silver Queen mine collapsed, I knew the Sterling Bank would tear your family apart. I also knew that if Preston ever realized what that land was worth to the railroad, He would use it to blackmail General Palmer, and he would use you to get it. So you bought my father's debt, she whispered, the realization bringing tears to her eyes. You married me to protect the land? Gideon sighed.
This story
a
was
heavy,
posted on the channel The
exhausted
Rusty
sound.
Saddle. Please
He
do not
leaned forward,
repost it in any
and
form.
for the first time, Adelaide saw a vulnerability in his stormy gray eyes. I married you to protect you, Adelaide. The quiet confession hung in the air, heavier than the snow on the roof. I saw you in Durango long before the crash, Gideon continued, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur. I watched you buy apples in the market. I watched you play the piano through the open window of your father's house while I was buying supplies. You were a creature of light in a town built on dirt and greed. When I saw Preston Sterling abandon you in that store, I couldn't stay in the shadows anymore. He reached across the desk. His hand, scarred from rock and ice, hesitated for a fraction of a second before gently covering hers. His skin was warm, calloused, and unbelievably grounding. The marriage was supposed to be a shield. I intended to bring you up here, keep you safe from the town's cruelty, and let you manage your own wealth once the railroad bought the Animus tract from you. You were always going to be free, Adelaide. The moment Palmer's check clears next month, you will be the wealthiest independent woman in the state. You can go to Denver, New York, Paris, anywhere you want. Adelaide looked down at his massive hand covering hers. She thought of the life she had left behind, the shallow friendships, the suffocating expectations, the conditional love of men like Preston Sterling. Then she looked around the sturdy, beautiful cabin. She looked at the man who had given up his anonymity to save her father, who had treated her with nothing but profound respect, and who looked at her now as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. Slowly, Adelaide turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his. And what if I don't want to go to Paris? She asked softly. Gideon's breath hitched. Adelaide, what if I have found that I prefer the quiet of the high timber? She continued, a small, genuine smile blooming on her lips. She stood up, gently tugging his hand until he stood with her. She closed the distance between them, looking up into his rugged, handsome face. You said you needed a partner, Gideon. I recall saying, I do at an altar. Gideon's eyes darkened with an emotion so fierce it made her gasp. He reached up, his rough hands trembling slightly as he cupped her face. He didn't ask for permission, and she didn't want him to. When his lips met hers, it was not the polite, sterile peck she had experienced with Preston. It was a kiss born of the wild mountains, deep, possessive, and burning with a heat that chased away the last lingering chill of the blizzard outside. Adelaide wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the man who was no longer a mystery, but her husband in every true sense of the word. They had weathered the storm, but the true battle for their future was only just beginning. The spring thaw of 1889 transformed the San Juan Mountains from a frozen fortress into a cascading wonderland of silver streams and blooming columbines. For Adelaide, the melting snow signaled the end of their isolated sanctuary and the beginning of a war. The letters from Denver had grown increasingly urgent. General William Jackson Palmer was ready to break ground on the narrow-gauge line. But the Sterling Bank, acting through a labyrinth of corrupt local officials, had filed an injunction against the Animus Valley tract. Josiah Sterling, Preston's ruthlessly pragmatic father, had caught wind of the railroad's path. He didn't just want revenge for his son's shattered wrist. He wanted the millions that came with controlling the mountain pass. Gideon and Adelaide descended the mountain not on a draft horse, but in a custom-built, reinforced carriage Gideon had ordered from a craftsman in Ouray. When they boarded the stagecoach for the grueling journey to Denver, Adelaide felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She was returning to the world of velvet drapes, mahogany boardrooms, and venomous whispers, the very world that had chewed her up and spat her out. But as Gideon covered her gloved hand with his rough, warm thumb stroking her knuckles, The fear dissolved. She was no longer the fragile Durango Rose. She was a woman of the high timber, forged in winter and married to the mountain itself. They arrived in Denver on a bustling Tuesday afternoon. The city, a loud, sprawling beast of brick and smoke. They took rooms at the opulent Windsor Hotel, the concierge. Taking one look at Gideon's weathered face and simple, sturdy clothes, moved to turn them away. Gideon merely dropped a solid gold coin on the marble counter and handed over a business card embossed with the insignia of the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. The concierge practically bowed them to the penthouse. The showdown was set for the following morning in the private chambers of the First National Bank of Denver. When Adelaide and Gideon entered the mahogany-paneled room, the air was thick with cigar smoke and tension. General Palmer, a distinguished military man with a sweeping mustache, stood by the window alongside David Moffett, one of Colorado's most prominent real-life financiers. But sitting at the long, polished table, looking like a pair of overfed vultures, were Josiah and Preston Sterling. Preston's right arm was bound in a stiff sling, and his eyes burned with a feverish hatred the moment he saw Gideon. Next to the Sterlings sat Judge Harrison Wyatt, a notoriously corrupt federal judge whose pockets were famously lined with sterling silver. General Palmer, Josiah Sterling drawled, not rising from his leather chair. "I am sorry to say this meeting is a waste of your valuable time. The deed to the Animas Valley tract is currently frozen. We have sworn affidavits stating that Horace Montgomery was not of sound mind when he transferred the land to his daughter's trust. The land rightfully belongs to the Sterling Bank to settle the Montgomery debts." Judge Wyatt pushed his spectacles up his nose, tapping a stack of legal documents. "The injunction is ironclad, General. The court must review the medical records of Mr. Montgomery, which could take years. However, the Sterling Bank is willing to assume the land and sell the right-of-way to the railroad immediately for the sum of $2 million. It was extortion, plain and simple. General Palmer's jaw tightened. "I will not be held hostage by a provincial bank manager, Sterling. Then you will not build your train," Josiah replied with a smug, oily smile. He turned his gaze to Adelaide. "And you, my dear, will return to Durango with nothing. A fitting end for a woman who married a feral ditch digger." Gideon didn't shout. He didn't even frown. He simply pulled out a wooden chair for Adelaide, ensuring she was seated comfortably before taking his own place at the table. He reached into his leather satchel and pulled out a single, neatly folded piece of paper. "Judge Wyatt," Gideon said, his voice a low, rumbling earthquake in the quiet room. "Before you rule on the validity of the Montgomery Trust, I suggest you look closely at the signature on your sworn affidavits. Specifically, the date." Preston scoffed. "We have the signature of the Durango County Clerk himself, verifying Horace's incompetence on the day of the transfer." Adelaide sat forward, her eyes flashing with a predatory intelligence she had learned from watching the hawks circle above their cabin. "My father suffered his stroke on a Tuesday, Mr. Sterling, the 14th of September. I know this, because I was the one who found him. The trust was legally established and signed on the 10th of September. 4 days prior, Josiah waved a dismissive hand. A minor clerical error. The clerk will testify that Horace was deteriorating for weeks." "The clerk will testify to nothing," Gideon interrupted smoothly. He slid the piece of paper across the table to Judge Wyatt. "Because the man who signed your affidavit, Elias Reed, was not in Durango in September. He was working for me, delivering surveying reports across the San Juans. That paper is a forgery, Judge, and presenting a forged document to extort a federal railroad project is a felony." Judge Wyatt's face drained of color as he looked at the paper. A meticulous, day-by-day employment ledger, signed and verified by a Pinkerton detective. The judge swallowed hard, suddenly very aware of David Moffett and General Palmer watching him with dangerous, unblinking eyes. This is highly irregular," the judge stammered, shoving his chair back. "I will need to withdraw the injunction immediately pending a federal investigation." "Excuse me." Wyatt practically ran
The
from
story
the
was
room,
posted on the
leaving
channel The Rusty
Sterlings
Saddle.
exposed.
Please do not
Preston
repost it
slammed
in any
his good
form.
hand on the table, spittle flying from his lips. "It doesn't matter. We still hold the original notes on the Silver Queen collapse. We will sue you into the dirt, Cross. We will tie you up in litigation until you are both rotting in that mountain shack." The heavy mahogany walls of the First National Bank of Denver seemed to shrink as Josiah Sterling's harsh, grating laughter echoed through the boardroom. He leaned back in his leather chair, a portrait of arrogant provincial power, desperately trying to regain control of a room that was rapidly slipping from his grasp. "My son is right, Mr. Cross," Josiah sneered, though a bead of sweat had formed at his temple. "You may have outmaneuvered us today with your Pinkerton ledgers, but the Sterling Bank has deeper pockets than a ragged surveyor playing dress-up. I will spend every dime I have to see you ruined. I will bury you in so many injunctions and appeals that you and your little bride will grow old and rot in that mountain shack before you see a single penny from the railroad." Gideon did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply leaned back in his chair, the storm in his gray eyes, perfectly, terrifyingly still. "You don't have any dimes left to spend, Josiah," Gideon said softly. The room went dead silent. David Moffat, the legendary financier, exchanged a bewildered look with General Palmer. Preston, still cradling his broken wrist in its stiff sling, blinked in dumb confusion. Gideon reached into his leather satchel one final time. He didn't pull out a single sheet of paper. He pulled out a stack of heavy, wax-sealed ledgers, dropping them onto the polished table with a thunderous thud. The gold-embossed lettering on the leather covers caught the dim light. The Boston San Juan Archival Company. For the past 3 years, Gideon began, his voice ringing with the cold authority of an executioner reading a sentence. The Sterling Bank has been dangerously over-leveraging itself to fund phantom silver strikes across the territory. You borrowed heavily from Eastern syndicates to cover your mounting losses, assuming that when you eventually stole the right-of-way through the Animas Valley, the railroad's payout would balance your ledgers. Josiah's smug smile vanished entirely. His face turned the color of old parchment. "How? How could you possibly know the intimate details of our Eastern creditors?" "Because," Gideon said, tapping the heavy ledgers with a scarred, calloused finger, "I am your Eastern creditor." Adelaide gasped, her gloved hands flying to her mouth. Gideon stood up, his massive frame towering over the table, casting a long, dark shadow over the two corrupt bankers. "While you were laughing at the dirty mountain man buying flour and nails in your town, my holding company was quietly purchasing your defaulted loans. I bought your debts, Josiah. I bought them for pennies on the dollar during the panic of last spring. Every single one of them. I own the paper on your bank. I own the deed to your grand mansion in Durango. I even own the promissory note on the carriage your son rode to the train station yesterday." Preston looked like he was going to be sick. He slumped back in his chair, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Gideon turned his steely gaze to the stunned railroad tycoon. "General Palmer, my wife and I are prepared to sign the right-of-way over to the Denver and Rio Grande Western this very afternoon. The land is hers, free and clear. In exchange, we ask only for the agreed-upon sum transferred directly into her name, and a private rail car on the inaugural train into Durango." "Done," Palmer said immediately, a wide, predatory grin spreading beneath his sweeping mustache. "It is a rare honor doing business with a man of your foresight, Mr. Cross. The check will be drafted within the hour." Gideon turned his attention back to the ruined men at the table. "As for you, Josiah, I am officially calling in your debts. In full. By 5 o'clock this evening, federal marshals will padlock the doors of the Sterling Bank. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate your properties before they throw you and your son into the street. Josiah Sterling, the man who had ordered Adelaide's ruin, who had stripped her father of his dignity and her of her future, opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked like a deflated, broken shell of a man. The undisputed kings of the county had been completely dethroned by the very man they had mocked as a savage. That evening, before the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks of the Front Range, Gideon and Adelaide took a private carriage to the foothills outside of Denver. They arrived at the Mountaire Sanatorium, a sprawling, pristine medical facility surrounded by manicured gardens and breathing the clean, thin air of the high altitude. Adelaide walked through the quiet, sunlit halls until she reached a large private suite at the end of the corridor. Sitting in a plush armchair by a grand window, looking out at the mountains, was Horace Montgomery. He was thinner than she remembered, his hair fully white now, but his eyes were bright and alert. The devastating effects of his stroke were still present, but the world-class care Gideon had secretly funded for the past year had worked miracles. Horace turned his head as the door opened, his face breaking into a crooked, joyful smile. Adelaide ran to him, falling to her knees beside his chair and burying her face in his lap, sobbing tears of absolute relief. Gideon stood quietly in the doorway, his hands clasped behind his back, giving them their moment. But Horace looked up, meeting the eyes of the towering mountain man. Horace couldn't speak in full sentences yet, but he didn't need to. He reached out a trembling hand. Gideon crossed the room in 3 long strides and took the older man's hand in a gentle, firm grip. Horace squeezed it. A silent, profound transmission of gratitude from a father to the man who had saved his daughter's life. Later that night, standing on the balcony of their penthouse at the Windsor Hotel, Adelaide leaned back against Gideon's chest. The city of Denver glittered below them, but her eyes were fixed on the dark, jagged silhouette of the mountains in the distance. $2 million, Adelaide whispered, the staggering sum, still refusing to settle comfortably in her mind. General Palmer's bank draft was locked securely in the hotel safe. We could build a palace anywhere in the world. Gideon, Paris, London, New York. Gideon wrapped his thick arms around her waist, resting his chin on the top of her head. We could, he agreed, his voice a low, comforting rumble. The choice is entirely yours, Adelaide. I meant what I said. You are free. She turned in his arms, looking up into his storm-gray eyes, which were now soft and filled with a quiet, undeniable devotion. She reached up, tracing the line of his jaw. I don't want a palace in Paris, she said fiercely. I want the smell of pine. I want the sound of the wind rattling the thick glass. I want the quiet of the high timber and the man who taught me how to survive it. I want to go home. Gideon pulled her tight against him, burying his face in her hair, breathing her in, as if she were the very air that kept him alive. Then we go home. Exactly 1 year to the day after Adelaide Montgomery had stood in the Durango First Methodist Church, in a fraying, borrowed dress, a deafening, triumphant whistle echoed through the Animas Valley. The entire town of Durango had gathered at the newly constructed brick depot. The air was thick with coal smoke and the electric buzz of anticipation. Mayor Peabody, wearing his finest sash, stood at the front of the wooden platform. Beside him was Sheriff Bill Langdon, and behind them pressed the gossiping socialites, including Martha Higgins, who was furiously fanning herself in the midday sun. They were there to welcome the first Denver and Rio Grande Western train, a marvel of modern engineering that would secure the town's prosperity for a century. Rumor had it that the mysterious architect of the Mountain Pass, a brilliant, multi-millionaire engineer from Boston who had single-handedly broken the sterling banking monopoly, was arriving on the inaugural run. The town was ready to grovel. They were ready to treat this unknown Mr. Cross like royalty. When the massive, gleaming black steam engine hissed to a halt, the crowd fell into a hushed, reverent silence. A uniformed porter stepped down, placing a velvet-lined step-box beneath the polished brass door of the luxurious private rear car, which bore the gold-painted name The Animas. The heavy door swung open, Stepping out into the crisp mountain sun was Adelaide. She did not wear the gaudy, imported silks of her past, nor the rags of her ruin. She wore a breathtakingly elegant, tailored traveling suit of deep, rich forest green velvet. Her posture was perfect, her chin held high. She looked radiant, powerful, and utterly untouchable. The women who had once crossed the muddy streets to avoid her, the men who had laughed at her wedding, now stared with their mouths hanging open in collective shock. A second later, a large, calloused hand reached out to help her down the steps. Gideon stepped onto the platform. His wild beard had been neatly trimmed, highlighting his sharp, aristocratic jawline, and he wore a masterfully tailored, three-piece charcoal suit that perfectly accentuated his broad, imposing shoulders. Yet, beneath
This
the
story was
expensive
posted on the
Eastern
channel
wool,
The Rusty
he still
Saddle.
moved with
Please
the
do not
dangerous,
repost it
quiet
in any
grace
form.
of the high timber. The town of Durango stared in suffocating, absolute silence. There was no laughter today. There were no cruel whispers. Mayor Peabody went pale, his prepared speech dying in his throat. Martha Higgins dropped her fan. Across the street, largely ignored by the spectacle, two figures were loading battered carpetbags into the back of a cheap, public stagecoach leaving for the barren plains. Josiah and Preston Sterling paused, watching the Durango Rose and her mountain man claim the town. Preston looked away, his face a mask of bitter, defeated ruin. Gideon didn't spare a single glance for the Sterlings, nor did he acknowledge the stunned mayor. He simply offered his arm to his wife. Adelaide smiled, a genuine, warm expression that held no malice, only the absolute peace of a woman who had won her war. She looped her arm through his. Together, the Mountain King and his bride walked through the parting crowd. The townspeople stepped back, clearing a wide path, finally realizing the terrifying truth of what they had done and exactly who they had discarded. A custom-built carriage, drawn by Gideon's massive draft horses, was waiting at the edge of the depot. Gideon lifted her inside, took the reins, and clicked his tongue. They left the stunned, silent town of Durango behind them, the carriage wheels turning steadily as they began the long, beautiful climb back up the mountain, returning to the only sanctuary that truly mattered. The saga of the mountain man and the ruined heiress became a legend whispered across the Colorado territory, a stark reminder that true wealth is rarely worn on the outside. Durango never forgot the day. The quiet hermit they had so ruthlessly mocked returned as the master of their economic fate. Yet, Gideon and Adelaide Cross did not rule with the cruelty they had suffered. Instead, they built a legacy of quiet philanthropy, funding the region's first public library and a hospital where no patient was ever turned away for a lack of funds. They proved that society's judgments are as fleeting as the mountain snow, easily melted by the enduring fires of truth and resilience. In the end, they found their greatest fortune not in gold or railroad iron, but in the unbreakable partnership forged in the isolation of the high timber.